Kia ora, good morning everyone, Fujifilm here. Welcome back to the channel. Today we are looking at the Tamron 17-70 f2.8 VC lens. This APS-C lens was originally released for the Sony E mount, but now it is available for the Fujifilm X mount as well. The optical design of this lens is supposed to be identical between the two versions. I want to say thank you to Tamron for sending me a pre-production sample to review this before launch, and let's see how does this lens performs on the Fujifilm camera. Let's have a look at the design of this Tamron lens first. This is a fast standard zoom lens that covers from 17mm to 70mm, so it's approximately 4.1 times zoom and it has a constant maximum aperture f2.8 across the whole focal length range. The aesthetic design of this lens is the usual Tamron style, which I like, but I do feel it may not exactly match the retro style Fujifilm camera body. For a 4.1 times f2.8 lens that also has the built-in optical image stabilization, the size of this lens is reasonably compact. Having built-in optical image stabilization is a very important feature, as a lot of Fujifilm cameras, even the current model, still does not have in-body image stabilization. Fuji's excellent 16-55 f2.8 lens also doesn't have optical image stabilization. The only Fuji zoom lens that has OIS are the slower aperture or variable aperture one, which means up until now, Fuji shooters has to choose either between a fast f2.8 zoom lens that doesn't have the optical image stabilization or a slower one that has optical image stabilization. But with this new Tamron lens, you can finally have both f2.8 constant maximum aperture and also optical image stabilization. I will talk about the image stabilization a little bit more and show you my test results in the next chapter of this video. The 17-70mm focal length range gives you very good flexibility. A zoom lens doesn't just allow you to go wide or zoom in the photo, it also allows you to capture the same scene but with very different perspective. Look at these two photos of the same bench that shot at wide and telephoto end of this Tamron lens. Even though the size and position of the bench is roughly the same in the photo, but these two photos look completely different. And this to me is the most powerful thing when shooting with a zoom lens like this Tamron lens. The weight of this lens is just over 500 grams, so it doesn't really feel heavy at all. And it is approximately 100 grams lighter than the Fujifilm 16-55 f2.8, which covers a narrower focal length range, and also that lens doesn't have optical image stabilization. But part of the reason why the Fujifilm lens is a bit heavier is that the Fujifilm lens does have a more metal construction than this Tamron lens. Having said that, this Tamron lens still has a metal lens mount and it is a weather resistant lens. The lens also has a front element that has fluorine coated, that is to protect it against oil and water. This is an internal focus lens, so the length of the lens won't change when you change the focus, but the front of the lens would extend a bit when you zoom in the lens. At the front of the lens, there is a 67mm front filter thread, just like a lot of the other recent Tamron lenses, and it comes with a reversible lens hood as well. There's no USB port or docking station for this lens, and that is because you can update the firmware of this lens through the camera body, just like if you are using a lens from Fujifilm themselves. So overall, the design and build quality of this lens is the usual Tamron standard. If you have used any of the recent Tamron lenses, you will know exactly what to expect. Like I've just mentioned before, one of the biggest selling points of this lens is that it has built-in optical image stabilization, or what Tamron calls VC. I cannot find the official figures about how effective the image stabilization of this lens is, but Tamron added a dedicated processor especially to control VC to allow this lens to get good image stabilization results. And here is a photo I shot at 50mm focal length. I was just standing there handhelding the camera with a 0.5 second shutter speed. I don't really have very stable hands, but the result is a very sharp photo. And then I did some more tests. I shot a few hundred photos at 70mm focal length at different shutter speed with and without the image stabilization to see how effective the optical image stabilization is when taking photos. From my results, the VC is approximately 3.5 stop effective, which is really not bad compared to my other image stabilization test results. But a big focus of this lens VC feature is actually for video shooting. For a lot of cameras and lenses, there are usually some switches or menu settings for its image stabilization feature. So you can tell the camera if you are just handholding the camera normally, or you are doing a panning shot, or some even require you to disable the image stabilization if you put the camera on a tripod. That is because image stabilization may work against you if it's trying to compensate the movement that you don't really want it to compensate. But with this Tamron lens, Tamron has used AI to train the processor to use the input from the gyro to determine whether the user is shooting in one of the 6 different modes. What that means is the lens can automatically determine if the user is walking or standing there, or if the camera is on a tripod, or if the user is actually panning or tilting or panning the lens diagonally. It no longer requires us to manually switch between different image stabilization mode, so it's easier to use, and also it minimizes the chance of user setting it incorrectly and get bad image stabilization results. Now, while I can't really say how much this AI processing has helped, but from what I can see, the stabilization when recording video works quite well overall. Look at this example of me shooting some video at 70mm handheld. You can see the big difference when I switch on the VC. So if you have shaky hands like me and your Fujifilm camera doesn't have in-body image stabilization, this Tamron VC lens would be really beneficial to you no matter you shoot photo or videos. This lens uses the Tamron RXD stepping motor for autofocus. It is compatible with the eye autofocus function on the camera, and I found the autofocus is fast and there is not much hunting. The autofocus operation is also very quiet as well, so that's fantastic for people who want to keep the camera as quiet as possible. I will talk about its autofocus performance when shooting video a little bit more later on in this review. A lot of Tamron lenses has very good close-up shooting capability. This 17-70 f2.8 VC lens is also the same. At 17mm focal length, the minimum focus distance is only 19cm or 7.5 inches, and that gives you the maximum magnification of 0.21 times, which is really good. Image is reasonably sharp when shooting at maximum aperture f2.8, and when you stop down to f5.6, then the sharpness becomes excellent. The only issue when shooting close-up photo at the wide angle end is that the front of the lens does get a bit close to the subject, which means you can easily cast shadow onto your subject, and it's also a bit tricky if you want to light up your subject very nicely. This is just the typical physical limitation when taking wide-angle close-up photos, and in this case with this Tamron lens, when shooting at 17mm focal length at the minimum focus distance, there's only approximately 5cm distance or 2 inches between your subject and the front of the lens. Luckily, because this is a zoom lens, you can avoid this problem by shooting at the longer focal length. If you shoot at telephoto and 70mm, the minimum focus distance is now 0.39 meter, and the magnification ratio is only slightly lower at 0.19 times, but that would give you much longer working distance between the front of the lens and your subject. The image is slightly soft at f2.8, but stop down to f5.6 and the image becomes very sharp, and you probably have to do that anyway to increase the depth of field of your photo. And now let's have a look at the image sharpness when taking photos at normal distance. And let's start with the center sharpness at the wide angle 17mm end first. At f2.8, the center sharpness is already excellent and very good contrast as well. No sign of chromatic aberration. Stopping down the lens make almost no difference in terms of center sharpness, as it was very good at f2.8 already, and the center sharpness remains great until around f11. After that, diffraction caused the image to become a bit softer. Now let's have a look at the corner. At f2.8, the corner is surprisingly sharp. Even the tiny letters, I can still read them quite easily. Stopping down would only marginally improve the corner sharpness. Focusing the photo on the center of the frame or the corner of the frame also doesn't seem to make any difference to the corner sharpness even at f2.8, which suggests the lens has quite minimal field curvature. And what about the telephoto and 70mm focal length? At f2.8, the center is also very sharp and I don't see any chromatic aberration as well. The contrast also appears to be excellent. And once again, stopping down the lens makes virtually no difference to the center sharpness until f11. And if we look at the corner, at f2.8, the corner is also pretty sharp, but stopping down the lens does improve the corner sharpness slightly. And just like what we have just seen at the wide angle end, focusing at the center or corner of the frame also makes no difference to the corner sharpness, which means there is also very minimal field curvature at the telephoto end of this lens as well. With the fast f2.8 maximum aperture, it is quite easy to achieve shadow depth of field effect either when you are shooting at the telephoto end of the lens or shooting close-up photos, and that allows you to dissolve the background into bokeh. I don't see any cat's eye or swirly bokeh. However, I do see a little bit of onion ring pattern in some of the photos, which I know some of you may not really like. This Tamron 17-70 VC lens has good chromatic aberration control. In some of my really high contrast photos, I can see a bit of color fringing, but the amount of color fringing is never really too severe and usually only visible if you zoom in the photo and do some pixel peeping. Bokeh also seems to be quite well controlled as well. In terms of distortion, a lot of mirrorless lenses heavily rely on lens profile to correct distortion, especially for the wide-angle lenses and zoom lenses, and it seems this Tamron lens also rely a bit on the profile correction to reduce the amount of distortion. With the lens profile correction, I can see a small amount of distortion, but the amount is kept at reasonable level no matter when I'm shooting at the wide end or the telephoto end. One downside about relying on distortion control is that sometimes it might ruin the corner sharpness quite a bit. But as we have seen earlier in the image sharpness test, this Tamron lens doesn't seem to sacrifice much corner sharpness for better distortion control. Just like distortion, this lens also relies a bit on the lens profile to correct vignetting. With the profile correction, when shooting at the wide angle end, I can see a bit of vignetting at f2.8. Stop down to f4 and it becomes a lot better, and I don't really notice any vignetting at f5.6. At the telephoto end, there is only a very small amount of vignetting even at the maximum aperture f2.8, and once I stop down the lens to f4, then vignetting becomes not really noticeable anymore. When shooting directly into a bright light source, I could see a bit of lens flare, but overall lens flare is still quite well controlled and never really becomes too excessive. Contrast also remains very good as well even when there is a bright light source in front of the lens. If you want to have sunstars in your photos, you will need to stop down the lens to around f11, then sunstars become visible. The 18-point sunstars looks alright if you stop down the lens further, but this lens is probably not my top choice if I want to have the best, sharpest sunstars. This lens has pretty decent Coma control. At the maximum aperture f2.8, there already isn't too much Coma visible, and once you stop down the lens to f4, then pretty much all Coma would disappear. If you are planning to use this lens to do some video shooting, I have some good news to share with you. Continuous autofocus works really well when I tested with the X-T3 running firmware 4.2. It managed to track and follow my movement quickly and quite smoothly. You can't hear any autofocus noise as well. Focus breathing is also very minimal both at the wide end and the telephoto end. I'm a bit surprised to see such minimal amount of focus breathing. I didn't really get around to review this lens when it was originally released for the Sony cameras, but I heard it is quite a popular lens among Sony APS-C camera users, and now I finally get a chance to test it out properly, and I think I understand why. The fast f2.8 maximum constant aperture combined with the optical image stabilization and the 17-70mm focal length makes this lens a really versatile lens, not just for photos but also for video as well. I'm really impressed by the lens sharpness both at the wide end and the telephoto end, even at the maximum aperture f2.8. Since the price of this lens is also a lot cheaper than the Fujifilm 16-55 f2.8, it makes it a really attractive choice if you want to have a fast standard zoom lens. So is there any downside of this lens? I guess I would say the construction feels a bit more plasticky than the Fujifilm lens, and the aesthetic design of this lens doesn't quite match the Fujifilm's usual retro style design. But if you don't really care about this too much, and just want a standard zoom lens that takes nice photo, that is very versatile and with a good price and also can handle video very well as well, this Tamron lens easily ticks all the boxes.